No
In other
pressure.
words, don't ask stupid questions.
All right. So let me kind of address your question, Judy. The Bible was basically formulated as a book following Nicaea Council. Okay, have you heard of that council?
Yeah, the Creed of the Nicene.
Yeah, the Nicene Creed. But the council was more important than just the creed. Here's what happened. Constantine was emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, this happened in around the area of Constantinople, right in that area, right? And some people will say he converted to Christianity. I don't think there's enough evidence to say that, but he definitely legitimized Christianity in a way that took them from being the persecuted minority to having a place of power in the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire became not just Roman, it became Holy Roman.
Right.
Okay?
That's true.
In doing that, they, I believe in some ways sold their soul. Because I think what Constantine said to them was, then you have to choose what is and what isn't Christianity. So one of the things that emerged out of that was then a choosing of the canon and choosing of what was not canonical. And so certain books, certain types of writings, the Gnostic writings, were all at that point rejected and pushed out of Christianity.
All things mystical.
Yeah, and a whole bunch of other things. And so that's when we voted on our canon. That's when we closed the canon and said, and we would never admit to this, but said essentially, God isn't speaking anymore. These are the only books through which God spoke. So we did some different things right there that made it so that we had to accept and reject in ways we hadn't had to do before then. And so
what was the year? What year was this about?
And it was in the 4th century. I think the council itself was 321, something like that. Okay. So it gave us strength, and we already had strength. The reason why Constantine did that is because the Christian they weren't little groups hiding in caves any longer. They'd moved beyond that, and they were fairly large bodies. And Constantine, as a political person, could see that things were happening, and he saw what the future was going to be, and he saw that this Christian movement was a future. And so he chose to legitimize it, but at a price to us. As political power usually comes with a price. Okay? If we try to enmesh our religion too much with our politics, politics usually wins out over our religion. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It's happening right now.
Yeah. So last week I gave you a sheet of paper and told you to read as many of those as you want to. Here's going to be our format today. Is we're going to
email that to me, Jim. I'm sorry, I didn't get it last week.
Okay, I will re-email it out to people.
Okay. I wasn't in this class last week.
Okay, what I'm going to try to do is I'll put this sheet of paper up on the screen so you can see what it looks like. Okay, it looks like that. If you would like for me to email this to you, what you want to do is in the chat box, just put your email address. I'll capture it and send this out to you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah,
Okay.
I got the other ones, so.
Yeah. And so down on the bottom, I put I put favorites, but with a question mark, because I'm not certain I like any of these completely, but they are some of the troublesome passages which give us great ways to be able to struggle with some of what's in the Bible. I'm going to, if you want me to, deal with a couple of them, But if you have ones that you'd rather deal with, let me know at any time, and I will honor what you would like to talk about more than me. And as you go through your stuff, as you look at how people have used the Bible before, feel free to say, here's some of the ways that I've seen people misuse the Bible. Okay? Because those things will help us a lot as we continue. So let me ask, first of all, does anyone have a favorite passage they'd like to deal with?
I sure do.
Okay, tell me about it. Which one is it?
It is. But I have to preface with saying that I really enjoyed looking up all of them.
Okay, good.
It was a great romp through the Bible.
Good.
But it's 1 Corinthians 14.
That was one of them I was gonna deal with, because I thought you might enjoy dealing with that one.
I sure do.
I'm gonna tie it to another one as well, if I can do that. So before we go to 1 Corinthians, will you go to Genesis 4?
Yep.
And if you want me to, I can put these up on the screen for us. I know how to do that if you want me to. Okay. Oops. Sorry, I was over here. I'm going to share my screen so you can see it. Where is it? Okay. So here's my screen, and this is the Genesis passage. It says, "Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And they built a city and named it Enoch after his son Enoch." So the first question, of course, is where did Cain, you know this story. This is the story of the first two children, Cain and Abel. And Cain killed Abel, right? So the first question you have to say is, where did Cain's wife come from if Cain and Abel were the first two children?
Yeah, there you go.
Right? Just that alone is a little bit troublesome. And it's because we look at it and we give a definitiveness to the Adam and Eve story that says that Adam and Eve were singularly the only two people that were there, right? And that's just, in my mind, not borne out in the scripture. I think that in the beginning of Genesis, at least, we see the best way I can describe it is a God of a valley, but not of the next valley over. Does that make sense? So God is the God and supreme being of this group of people, but God's not. The story's not dealing with the land of Nod over here, which is another group of people that have whatever God they have, but that's not the purview of the book. Okay? But then the question also that's there is, it says Cain knew his wife, and his son is named Enoch, but his wife is not. And thus begins a whole progression throughout the Old and the New Testament of diminishing the role of the feminine.
Right.
Right? Here was an important woman, and yet she is left unnamed. All she is Cain's wife, Enoch's mother. Now here I am talking to 4 different women in front of me. How do you feel about that, ladies?
Well, the whole Bible pretty much, the New Testament pretty much diminishes women.
It does an awful lot of that. You're exactly right. And it's allowed us to absolutely perpetuate that pattern in today's world if we want to. And there's a bunch of people who want to diminish the role of women or limit the role of women.
I know in the evangelical church when I was there, women could not lead a group that men were in.
Yeah.
And women could not certainly could not be pastors or deacons or anything like that. I mean, and women were to obey men in the house.
Yeah.
And that was very strict.
And much of that is because of the passage that we're going to look at in a second, the one that Sandy just brought up to us. And it is one that has often been used. But I'm going to tell you that as I've talked to my friends, my evangelical friends, it's hard for me not to hear I don't want to listen to women inside of their defending their actions of I don't have to. Why is it that we as men don't want to listen to women? What is it about you ladies that so intimidates us?
Well, it's a social norm. I think it's been normal all the time, and so men think they can do it.
Absolutely. We've set up a world that works well from a male perspective. So why should we listen to the women? It helps me, it benefits me, and yet at the same time, it does not benefit all.
Well, in Paul's case, I think that he just had a bad opinion of women because he knew Christ forgave sinners. He knew Christ healed on the Sabbath. He knew all these social norms Christ broke. But this one he perpetuates in all of the churches he goes to, saying, no, women can't be heard. Well, I think it's his personal peeve, and I don't like Paul.
Yeah, and that's really hard because especially, I like a lot of what Paul says, but I do not like his attitude towards women. He is a misogynist, from my opinion at least, and for whatever reason, and we have no clue what that reason is, why he had such a poor view of women. But he definitely says things in ways that the male-dominated society have canonized and said that has to be true.
Could have been part of the culture there. I mean, was patriarchy that big a deal in Roman culture?
It wasn't so much Roman, although Roman did have some, but Roman was much more egalitarian than what the Jewish world was. The Jewish world had very definitely a male-female divide at that time. One that has been perpetuated onward, just as it has in Christianity, where there's a very strong male bias in parts of Judaism, even down to this day. But in the Old Testament, like that passage I showed you about Cain, there's very definitely a downplaying of a female in favor of male.
Jim, isn't that because that Genesis was written by monks who were probably sequestered and didn't have any to do with women? You know, I mean,
well,
it
wasn't written by the monks that we know, but it could have been written by Jewish monks way back when. It was definitely people who were influenced by a certain set of things. If you notice, for example, even today at the west wall of Jerusalem, the Wailing Wall, only men can approach the wall. Many Jewish congregations to this day will divide, and many Christian congregations. So I'm not trying to downplay what Jews are doing. Will separate men and women on separate sides of the worship space. When I was 19 and down in Argentina, they did that in the synagogue that I went to.
Do you think it had to do some with sexuality?
That's often, because I think that's what we have to ask is why all is it that we as men are intimidated by you as women? And I think that sometimes it is sexuality. That power of the sexual drive that you guys have as a gender does intimidate us. There's no doubt in my mind, at least that's part of it. Why else do you think it is that men might be intimidated by women?
Our ability to procreate.
Absolutely. You know what we did back in the middle parts of the last 2,000 years? We decided that it really wasn't your power. What we did as men is we placed inside of your womb a homunculi, right? Which was a fully formed human being that just you gave it a space to live in, but we were really all of the genetic factor that was there.
Of course.
Oh, that's a riot.
Isn't that funny that we figure that type of thing out in order to take away power from you, because that gift of what you can do, that somehow in you life can form, really is an amazing thing, but it leaves us out of some of that, especially us as what our science proved at that time, that we didn't know that men had much power at all, right? All of a sudden you'd be pregnant, and we didn't always know why,
Yeah.
right? And so I think that you're right. That act of birth was a powerful, too often a powerful negative for us because it was so unexplainable by us. What else?
If it's the accepted social order
That's
and
right.
fraternize too much with the women, well then, oh, you're weak.
That's right.
Let the
Because
women-
that sense of weaker sex, we as men absolutely took that on. We decided we were the stronger, you were the weaker. And obviously, if it comes to musculature, as a general rule, that's true. But there's a whole lot of other ways to define weaker or stronger. For example, the birthing process. That's a pretty strong thing,
Yes.
right? And
Yeah.
and maybe that's why we struggled against that birthing process, because you are so strong in that, but we can't give credence to it if we want to say we're the stronger sex.
It all makes me kind of wonder what Christianity would have been like if women were given equal footing and did write books for the Bible. Maybe they did and they just weren't, what would it all look like if women had had more power?
Right. And the truth of the matter is we see evidence in the Gospels of where they were trying to give power. Unlike Paul, who absolutely had an anti-female bias. If you look at the Gospels, not so much John's Gospels, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke's, you see a lot of evidence of Jesus giving a place to the feminine
Yes.
in remarkable ways, right? All the stories of this time of year. Who was it that first saw the risen Christ, right?
Women.
Who were the ones who announced the new truth? And it was the women, right? And you see a lot of that where Jesus opened his world in a very un-Jewish way, very un-first century way, to the feminine around him. And yet we soon lost that. Probably partially because of men like Paul, who seemed to be very intimidated by that very same thing that Jesus didn't seem to be intimidated by. So let's pull it forward a little bit. Where have all of you had to face this within church circles in our century? How have walls been put up against who you were?
Well, I remember one of my very first church meetings, and we were deciding who was going to be what. And so the guy next to me says, well, Sandy can be the secretary. She has nice writing. Well, what if I wanted to be something else?
Yeah.
He was one that his wife was way in the background, couldn't speak. And when I was yappy like I am now, he didn't like it. So I could be a secretary and write and be quiet.
Yeah, we definitely gave certain roles too. When we tell the story of the Last Supper, for example, we admit that women were there, but we pretty much just assume they're just the ones cooking and serving, because those are acceptable roles. And they couldn't have been around the table with the other disciples, could they?
No.
And that's too bad that we decided that those are the only roles where we can honor the women in Jesus's life. Because in my mind, it was undoubtedly not just that. I mean, the story of Mary and Martha, where one sat at Jesus's feet, it's a remarkable story, right? Because she's right there with him, not
The story
off
of
serving, right?
Right.
How else have you faced the perpetuation of this, of Paul's stuff in our church today? Paul's, let me say it in the harshest terms I can, Paul's misogyny.
Really. It wasn't until the 70s that women could even be, I mean, the Presbyterians, it was as big a fight over women becoming leaders in the church as it is now now it's sexuality. It was gender in the 70s.
Right. In fact, in the midst of all of our current arguments, I often see people going back to that argument and trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out how to say, this is what we finally did in that argument. We decided that not all of us were going to be at the same space, but that moving forward this way was what needed to happen. But we still haven't figured out how to really truly let that in a full way, have we?
No.
I was raised
Go ahead.
I was raised in the Presbyterian church. And even in the 80s, my husband and I were invited to they called it an agape dinner, which was a dinner for about 4 couples to get together and share a meal and not have children around, so an adult gathering. And during the discussion at the dinner, this was a Presbyterian church, but I was no longer active in that church. During the discussion at the dinner, they talked about who they were going to elect for elders and deacons in the church. And in the Presbyterian church, elders are not pastors. They're just like senior deacons, kind of.
Yeah, yeah.
And so the presbytery wanted to know if we were going to finally have a female elder. And we told them no. They had been dictated to by the church, by the presbytery, that they had to have at least one woman. And they said, well, the reason we're not going to have one is because the only woman that we felt was qualified is unwilling to run. Now, this is the way they got around it. First of all, they decided only one woman was fit to run.
Yeah, yeah.
And they talked with her, and she didn't believe that women should be elders. And so she said she wouldn't run. That's the way they worked the system.
And let me just guess. Every single one of those men were perfect and had no reasons to disqualify them at all.
Right, right. You should have heard the conversation about whether or not a woman was qualified after that.
I'll bet.
Well,
You know, the one thing that's been easier for my path as going into ministry is watching the women around me have to go through a much more difficult path. They were questioned much in a very different way than what I was. They are, every time they go into a new ministry setting, there's a barrier that's there that I don't have to face. And so that made my pathway easier, but at the same time, it was the struggle of, why do I get the privilege? And
Yeah.
yet that's what we do again and again, even to this day.
And
Let me
especially
check real
women
quick
of
and see how
color.
Bob is doing. Bob, we can see you. Can you hear us? You can hear us over your phone?
I
Okay.
can't.
So we're still not hearing you. Check your volume just to be sure, because maybe it's that, but at least we can see you. And if you can hear us, you'll get something out of this at least. Okay.
I can't see him either.
Oh, you can't? Okay. I can see him at least.
I can see him, but I can't hear him.
I think we're missing one big piece about this whole thing is one of the reasons why I think Paul did this, one of the reasons why the writer of Genesis did this, is because frankly, you women mess up our neatly ordered masculine worlds by the way you think and the way you act and the way you relate. And so I think that it's just simpler if you guys are given little space and little voice, because then I can just use my own masculine mind. And I don't mean that you're wrong. It's just easier for us as men. And so I think we perpetuate it because of that. You guys, well, I guess what I'm saying is you guys screw things up.
And if we can't talk, then you'll always be right.
That's right. And it's tough that when I look at something like this, I can only see let me do what benefits me versus what truly benefits us. What have we lost in the centuries by not listening to the feminine voice?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Amazing. I mean, a huge, and as a society, what have we lost?
What have we lost? Right? And
I mean,
much
we're
of
just
it,
getting women even in the Senate and the House and in government.
yeah.
Not president yet.
Yeah. And a lot of it goes back to exactly the passage that Sandy pointed out from 1 Corinthians, which essentially says, women sit down and shut up.
Yeah,
Yep.
right.
And it probably made it easier because, I'm guessing it had something to do with this. I don't know about the whole of his misogyny, because it went beyond this. But there's no doubt that in every church I've been in, I've needed to look at least one woman and say, sit down and shut up. But I've had to do that with at least one man in every church as well. But if I generalize that to the whole gender, that's where it gets bad. Right?
Right.
And that's the canonization that says only this works. So going back to what we talked about, where we kicked out some of the threads of Christianity, where we said that those things don't work for us. What we were really saying is that's just more challenging for me, and so let me make it simpler for me at your expense.
I think somewhere along the way, I have to believe that women were active. They just weren't represented in the writings, but I can't believe that we were totally meek the whole time.
The thing of it is,
we
Judy,
were passive.
Yeah, the thing of it is I think women have always been very active in the church in a lot of different ways, sometimes in very much male drawn out roles, right? They said, here's all you can be. But I think there's a very real case to be said that women have saved the Christian church throughout the centuries in a lot of ways. Okay, and some of those are celebrated women, the Joans of Arc, that have stepped into roles very strongly. But it's sometimes been battling the male in the midst of it that didn't want to give him that space. If you look at somebody like the people who have seen some of the miracles, right? The women who have called out and said, Jesus appeared in this way. Very often those were almost always feminine character, feminine, what's the word I'm looking for? Those were women who were there in that space, and they were seeing the world through feminine eyes. They were saying, God can still be present. I saw him in this way.
Well, in the church I taught, there was Dorcas, and there was who's the other one? Lydia, and a lot of leaders.
Right. If you look at the end of Romans, the 16th chapter of Romans, where Paul is essentially saying, say hi to this person, say hi to that person, all the folks that he loves. Then he says, I'm getting to it real quick. Talks about Junia. And he says, greet Andronicus and Junia, my relatives who are in prison with me. They are prominent among the apostles. Okay, so he's calling both Junia and Andronicus apostles. And Junia is a female name. So even Paul, in one of his most undisputedly his books, his writings, acknowledges that there were women who were prominent in the church at that time. And yet we've used Paul to be able to say, but they can't be in our time. The hard part is we can't solve it all, can we? It's a passage that will be continually misused, but we can continually set a different example of. Okay, we can go back and give a name to Cain's wife if we want to. And it doesn't matter that what the name is, it matters that we acknowledge that she was a full human being and a wondrous person to be able to acknowledge. And again, many of the biblical women were the wife of, the woman who, all of those kinds of things. And we can start acknowledging them differently than that. Not just the role they were in or the relationship that they had, but somehow acknowledging them for the power of the person that they were.
And not as a Jezebel or a whore.
Not just as the Jezebel or whore that sometimes is what comes out, right? But that's going to take a lot of very intentional work to not believe that piece of the Bible that Paul wrote and said, let women be silent. We have to dispute that and say, no, I need that woman's voice. It'll take a lot for us to do that because it'll be an ongoing battle because there's a whole bunch of centuries of too much power in the masculine.
Well, and it's still going on in many denominations of the Christian church.
Yep, still going on.
Yep.
And on a regular basis. Just
Yep.
things like, for example, the Catholic Church that allows no women at all in the priesthood.
Yeah.
Right?
The women, I went to a Christian church with my sister-in-law and brother once, and the women, I noticed that all the people who served communion were men.
Uh-huh.
So I asked her about that later. I said, I didn't see any women serving communion. Why is that? And she said, well, it's biblical.
Yeah.
That's this day and age.
Yeah. Yeah. But a lot of that continues to perpetuate.
Yeah.
Sometimes we very purposely made all of that happen too. We've chosen to believe stories about the women there. We've chosen to make up stories that denigrate the women. Okay, so for example, the story of the birth of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
His mother has to become a virgin because, of course, we don't want anything human to sully her, right? So it's only divine. She's just the vessel for the seed of God. Not she can't, you know,
Yeah.
she can't be human.
Yeah.
The stories of the women around Jesus, where sometimes they were the prostitute. We take the Mary Magdalene and we turn her only into the woman who committed adultery, and we denigrate that woman, never asking about the man who committed adultery with her. Right? We have a whole lot of just built-in misogyny in those scriptural passages, those stories that we all know.
Well, it's in society as a whole. It's not just, I think until it changes more in society as a whole. I mean, we are a patriarchy, and that's the basis of our whole government, of everything it's been. So
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to change in the churches, but I remember at Calvary, you couldn't, I mean, the Bible studies were separate because women studied together and men studied together, but you couldn't have, because they couldn't mix them, because you couldn't have women leading a group that had a man in it, even one man in it, because
Yeah.
women are not allowed to lead anything that has a man in it.
Yeah, yeah. And why do you think that is? What is it that they think that woman will do to that man? Mess his male mind up? Because we do a really good job messing our own minds up already.
It wasn't something you were allowed to even ask. It was like, when I asked that question, it was biblical. I mean, it's everything. It's like, when I asked somebody why they voted for Trump, I said, look at what he says about women. The women I was around were like, but we were voting for him for biblical reasons.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like, what Bible are you reading?
Yeah. Yeah. But we do a lot of allowing non-biblical reasons to become biblical, and overemphasizing this. Okay, when we put this in the whole of the Bible, there's a continual stream of women that are given very strong spaces. If you go back to even the Old Testament and you look at the book of Judges, some of the strongest judges were women, people like Deborah. The book of Ruth is an incredible story, right? And so we have just as many evidences of how we should be honoring the feminine voice among us, and yet we've chosen to hear only the other. And I think we have to start choosing different very intentionally and honoring that larger story. The hard part is that I think some of this developed way back into the Old Testament. So if we look at the story of the people of God, and by that I mean the men of God first of all. Okay? So we look at Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. They are the ones that we celebrate as the great fathers of the faith, right? Even Abraham before that. The women who come in, their wives, usually came from a foreign tribe and are always looked at a bit suspiciously, and sometimes in a very negative way. Like, for example, Joseph's wives, Rachel and Leah, and the two slaves. The two slaves are hardly given a name, although they bore the majority of the sons. Rachel and Leah is always looked down on, and the only one that is loved is Rachel. We have a continual struggle to try to figure out how to tell this story that is right about women, because there's so many stories doubting that. Now, partially that's because as they came in from the other valley and polluted the valley of God's people, they came in with some different ideas. Maybe they came in carrying the God of the valley that they were a part of. And so maybe they were part of who corrupted the faith. And so maybe that's part of the bias that's there. I don't think it's a right bias or a good bias, but if you think that there's only one direction that God can speak, then you accept that type of bias. And today we apply that same type of bias against women who often have at least as strong a legacy as what the male voice does. At least as strong and deep of an education. And yet we can not give that credence. Catherine.
I finally am able to say something. I think that is fine, but we're talking all around everything rather than specifics. And I think we have to start with where we are, which is at St. Francis and what we do within this church. And that's like anything, I make change in my life one-on-one. So, you know, maybe that's a question to ponder. How can we make it more inviting? But I think women have to take some responsibility. I'm going to speak up for that, taking responsibility for ourselves if we want to have certain experiences and want to do certain things. What can we do to be in a mindset that wants to participate in services more directly? Yeah. And again, talking more about lay leadership. So I really think that I would like us to focus just personally here in this time. I mean, we just are kind of talking around things, and we're talking about other churches, which I don't give a hoot about, or other experiences. I want to be in the moment, the present moment, and think about the future of how we can be at St. Francis. And just like we're the welcoming church, just like we are inviting full participation from our gay, lesbian, and transgendered folks, and that everybody is welcome. So, I mean, women need to step up to the plate too. So it's not just having things done for us or to us. We need to ask for what we want. Just saying.
Thank you very much.
But I think the history is also very important.
It is important, but Catherine has a very good point, is that we get to decide how we in our space act and allow things to happen. Are we speaking to our young women, our children, and telling them the story of life differently than what we were told? Are we allowing them to have a voice in ways that maybe you guys in your generation weren't given a voice the same way? Are we in our leadership honoring the feminine as well as the masculine? Or are we giving credence to one or the other? Because we need to have, I believe the yin and yang of the masculine and feminine is really important, and that both enhance the other. And when we emphasize either one, we fail. We have to have the fullness of who we are, and we have to honor that. I get really upset about some of the depictions of what masculinity is, and it's usually a way of saying it's not that womanly stuff, that feminine, that awful stuff. And we use some of our worst pejoratives in a very anti-woman way, right? Don't be a girl about it. Come on, step up and be a man.
You run like a girl.
You run like a girl. That's exactly right.
You run like a girl.
That's exactly right. And so we have to, right now, we have to be the model to the young people entrusted to us about saying a different story. We have to be the model of our 30-year-olds, giving the women among them a voice in a way that we didn't have when we were 30. Right? Or that the image that we weren't given. I grew up in a very patriarchal church, and at 30, I was told I was the only one in my family who could do this, that, or the other thing. That's wrong, right? We have to tell the other story. All right, that's a lot of stuff on one scripture. Well, two. I brought in the one from Cain as well. But it's an important issue, isn't it?
It is.
Who has another scripture that they'd like to look at? Sandy, thank you for that one and making us talk for like most of the time about it and solve it all.
It's a good one.
It is a big one, isn't it?
Jim, I'm going to have to step away to go to the finance meeting, but
Okay.
I wanted to join you for the time I was available.
All right, I'll be there in just a little bit.
I'll see you next week.
Okay.
Right.
So here's these other passages. And I can take this one and I can say, we solved this one. All right.
Yeah, check
We
that off.
fixed this one. We got everything taken care of on those two.
You know, one issue I brought up, I know, in one of the Bible studies I was first at, because I really had no Bible training.
Yes.
The pack was Noah's Ark. I don't know if that's on one of your list things there.
It's not, but that's a good one to struggle with. Tell us your struggle.
Well, when we read it and stuff, they asked me what I thought of it. And I said, well, to me, this tells me God's a mass murderer. Well, people just about spit out their coffee. It was that I had a woman counsel me one-on-one for like 3 weeks about that. Why God was not a mass murderer, because these were actually not full people. They had been some kind of, people had gotten together with demons or something. Anyway, I forget the word, I've forgotten all the reasoning behind it now, but it was like, why did God have to get rid of everybody on earth but 2 people?
Yeah.
And 2 of all animals? That just seemed obscene to me.
Well, and it ought to. I mean, that's stuff we shouldn't fit into our head. Sorry, I thought I didn't realize I was sharing all that when I was looking for something else. You're right, Judy, that we should struggle with that passage. But you know what we do very often with Noah's Ark is what we do with a lot of passages. We believe what I call the junior Sunday school answer. Right? God saved the world and all the animals in it, and we do that trying to give a literal interpretation to it that the story doesn't ask for. It's in the most mythological part of our Bible, which is trying to tell us types of how God acts, not literal interpretations of. I listened to a guy on Christian radio one day say, well, of course there were dinosaurs on the ark. You know, you don't have to make all that fit. That's not the purpose of it.
Oh, that's great.
Whoa.
And yet we do all of those kinds of things, right? What we're trying to figure out is what does that story teach us, but also what's the larger story of? How many saw the Noah's Ark movie from a couple years ago? You ought to go watch it because it does a couple of really interesting things in there the director of the movie makes some choices that are remarkable. Okay, so at the beginning of the story, he actually refers to, he shows something in there that he never really deals with. He just places them in there. So let me get to the passage so you can see what I'm going to talk about. It's from Genesis 5. Okay, which comes right before the what we think of as the Noah story. So let me, or maybe it's Genesis 4. Wait, let me look. Okay. Well, I think I was right, but I can't see it right here.
There it is. I see it. Okay, I'm looking at chapter 6, verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth.
The Nephilim. Thank you. It's chapter 6, not chapter 5. Thank you.
Christians were telling. That's what they were telling me, that these were not true people. They were Nephilim.
Yeah. Okay, so let me put the passage up so everyone can see it. When people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, and took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the Son of God went into the daughters of human, who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. Okay, now listen to this. It's not giving half human status to that, Judy. Did you notice that?
Yeah.
It's giving advanced human status to that. It's saying they were more than. They were the sons of God, were their fathers, and the daughters of human. They were warriors of renown, heroes. It's giving huge status to them, and yet we turn it into a smaller status. But the reality is we don't know. This is a very mythological passage. It sounds very much like if you read some of the theogonies of ancient Greek mythology, you'll read that same type of passage in there. And because we don't understand it, though, we tend to discount it. We tend to say, I don't get it. It's something else. But the maker of the Noah movie put them in there. And this is how he did it, because this comes right before the Noah and the ark story. And as the ark is being built, what you see is that a lot of the builders of the ark are these large, dark characters, and he never explains them. He just has them in roles where they are doing the building of the ark. I think that's trying to give voice to this chapter 5 that said there were Nephilim, there were heroes, there was somebody there who did something that we don't understand. But because we don't understand it, we discount it. We pass it over. In particular, the reason why we want to pass over something like this is because this makes our scripture mythological in the very same way that we look down on in Greek mythology or Roman mythology or Norse mythology. Well, those stories don't make sense. They're obviously made up. But if we give credence to this, we have to say the same thing. If we're going to say that about their mythology, we have to say it about ours. And we don't want to say ours are made up, because ours are divine. You know, ours are God's hand writing on stone. Yours are obviously just imagination. Do you see the struggle there? And yet there it is in our scripture. So we give it a story, Judy, like you said. Oh, those are half humans. They were something lesser than. Well, no, that's not what the story's telling us. But we often pass on that which benefits us rather than what is truly there.
And the story never really describes all these people drowning.
Doesn't describe it all.
It glosses over that completely.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're just kind of vapor.
Yeah. The good news is, Judy, is that we have larger than just the canon to be able to help us with some of these things. Okay? So the Jewish faith has a much, I believe, much better relationship to Scripture than what we do. They continually add another layer to it. They give themselves permission to be able to tell stories about the stories. As long as they don't go against the heart of what's there, they can continue to ask, what are the questions around this, right? And so in the Moses story of the crossing of the Red Sea, there's one of these stories that talks about, okay, so all of Pharaoh's army gets killed, right? But the children of Israel all escape. And everybody in heaven is rejoicing. Oh, look what God did, saved all the children of Israel. And Michael the archangel is looking around going, but where's God? Finally finds him back in a corner, sobbing. Says, God, what's going on? And he says, didn't you see how many of my children died in those chariots in the middle of the Red Sea? And so it asks that question of not just who did God save on the ark or in the crossing of the Red Sea, but what about that growing thing that we know, that where we're saying, but God is not just the God of a valley, of a certain group of people, but that larger God. And it's asking that question. And if we take the small story, the easy story, then we miss that deeper question.
I think I missed the deeper question. What was the deeper question again?
Can the people who died in that moment, right? The Pharaoh's army in the middle of the Red Sea, or the people that were on the outside of the ark, can they still be God's people as well?
Yeah.
So the director of the Noah movie, that's where he takes this. He has Noah arguing the whole time and struggling with the thing, up to the point where he makes sense of a story that comes after the Noah and the ark story. Okay, so let me show you that story. Okay, so at the end, you can see that this section over here was Noah pleases God. And so he did all these things. He of the birds of their kind, of the living beings of all flesh, he put them all in the ark and saves everyone. And we have the great flood, right? Continues for 40 days. Go into Genesis 8. The flood comes down and we get the rainbow, right? Noah builds the altar, and God promises, I'll never do this again. But listen to what happens here. Now Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard, and he drank some of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and took his two brothers outside. And it begins to talk about Noah in a very different way. That here at the end of his life, in spite of what he was at the beginning, he became a drunkard. And the way that the author of the director of the movie did was, it was because of the very difficult decision he had to make to save his family at the expense of all the other families, that caused a conflict in his soul that he was never able to escape from. But we don't tell that second story. We don't tell about Noah the drunk, because that goes against the hallelujah, God got it all figured out. It dirties the story, doesn't it? And if I want to rest in my simple junior Sunday school answer. I can't tell that other story.
Okay.
I have to go to that same meeting that Peggy went to. Continue to look at the different passages that are at the bottom of that sheet. If you haven't gotten a sheet yet, I will send it to you. Does anybody else not have this sheet that I've been showing you? This sheet right here. Oops. Is there anyone else who doesn't have this sheet of paper? If you don't have it, if you would like for me to send it to you, please give me your email address. You can type it into the chat boxes, or you can send a message here to church and I will get it to you. Just give me an email address and I'll get it to you. And read through those passages or come up with your own. There's plenty of scriptures in there to struggle with. And we'll keep struggling. If Sandy doesn't give us any more that take us most of one whole hour, we'll get through some.
I promise.
Thank you.
All right, my friends, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ooh. Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.